appreciate it if you would type it out so I can read it to my wife when I get home. I hope you will fill out those evaluations and read the questions carefully. Liam Pacala, the head of the Association of Theological Schools, tells of a survey that they took some time ago, and one of the questions was, list the faculty members of your institution broken down by sex. Somebody filled it in and said, sex isn't our problem, it's alcohol. I have appreciated very much the opportunity to be here. It would be ungracious of me not to thank Dr. Perkin for the welcome that he extended to me from the university and invited me to share a lunch with him and with the other executives of the school. And certainly I guess I owe a debt to Dr. Mitten for the elevator ride we had in Pittsburgh. And for the assurance that it doesn't snow in this part of the world. He told me it gets cloudy and it gets wet. The only place I know where it takes 3 days to shovel wet and cloudy. And then, of course, to Dr. and Mrs. McRae, you are blessed to have a scholar and an evangelist in the same person. Seems to me that's a wedding that we desperately need. And by the warmth of their hospitality, they have set the reputation for the Scotch back considerably. Although that's not completely true. I thought of him as a great patriot when we met down in Arizona a few weeks ago. He asked me if I believed in free speech. I just discovered he meant the honorarium. But I've appreciated, too, the welcome that you have given me. Your warmth has certainly kept this cold of the out of doors getting through to me. It's been a delightful privilege to be here, and I will cherish for many years, if God gives them to me, the memory of my visit here. And should any of you happen to be back in Colorado and in Denver, you're at the airport, you need a place to stay, you need something to eat, by all means give us a call. Our name is in the phone book. We'll be glad to pray for you. The devil made me say that. But in the words of Isaiah the prophet, you're a great bunch. Just one word that might be of some help to you. One of the things that we do at Denver Seminary to help preachers is to produce a series of tapes called expositation. 4 times a year we deal with some aspect of homiletics and preaching. We have talked about how to preach the parables, how to preach the miracles, how to preach Old Testament hymnic literature. We've talked about funeral sermons and how to preach lengthy passages. At any rate, they cost $12 a year. Our basic arrangement is that if you can't afford $12 a year, send us whatever you can. We'll send them to you. We've said to others, if you can afford a bit more, send that to us. We'll put it in the pot. Last time I looked, a few months ago, we have about 900 pastors that get it, and we were about $40 a head. So we aren't running a school on exposit tapes. But if that would be something you'd be interested in, I'd certainly be delighted to have that further ministry to you. They come out 4 times a year, but given the Canadian Post Office, you might get it once every 4 years. Ultimately, will send them out, and hopefully you'll get them. And if you would like to get exposit tapes, let me give you the seminary address, okay? It's a Denver Seminary called Exposit Tapes, Denver Seminary, Box 10,000, Denver, Colorado, 80210. That's all the address you need, just Denver Seminary. Rip off the top of your father's safe deposit box and send us the contents. Send it to Denver Seminary, Box 10,000, Denver, Colorado, 80210.
Say that once more, please.
Denver Seminary, spelled D-E-N. Box 10,000.
Where's the comment?
Yeah, the comment. Denver, Colorado, 80210. And the name of the series is Exposit Tapes.
Dr. Robinson, I get the tapes, and as I mentioned to you before, they've been really effective for me, so I recommend them for every pastor here. It's extremely practical and very helpful.
Political announcement.
Take it any way you can get it.
Did you get this series free or what?
Yeah, you get this free. If you ask people, what is the shape of preaching? There are some folks who will tell you it's in pretty good shape. There are people who come to your church and Sunday after Sunday sit in your pews and listen to what you have to say. For them, preaching may be their spiritual lifeblood. For them, it's a high occasion of the week. My mother-in-law, before she died, was the kind of person who was blessed and benefited by the preachers in her lives. She read the Bible every day, but she did that because it was club rules. I doubt seriously that Mom Vic ever learned much for herself of significance from her reading of the Scriptures. Most of what she learned, most of what she knew, most of what she believed had come from the preachers in her life. Some of them had preached in such a way that she came to faith and Savior. A couple of them, I guess, lied to her. Others encouraged her. But until the day she died, I would get a letter from her every week giving me a kind of outline of what the sermon was about the week before. Her legion is multitude. Her name is multitude, and she would say that preaching was in pretty good shape. Another group of people out there would say it's in pretty bad shape. They haven't been around church lately to check up on it, but they're pretty sure that preaching is kind of art of talking in someone else's sleep. And they are sure that it's irrelevant, that it's boring, it's insipid, it's dull. They have written it off as an exercise in futility. John Cleveland would say that the shape of preaching is an ellipse. It has double center. One of the centers is in the Bible. The other center is in the man of the world. Great preaching takes place when flint strikes steel. When the flint of a person's problem strikes the steel of the Word of God, you get the spark. And from the spark, you sometimes get the glow. Some sermons are too flinty. They deal with people's problems. In that sense, they are highly relevant. But they never bring them back to the sure foundation of the Word of God. Other sermons are too steely. They are filled with biblical content of the long ago and the far away. But somehow they never cross the barrier and get into the 20th century. You have to have both. Shape of preaching is an ellipse. It has two centers, one in the Bible, one in the 20th century. A couple of nights ago, we worked our way through a passage of Scripture. Tonight, I'd like to look at preaching from a different perspective. I'd like to look at preaching from the perspective of the person in the 8th row, 5 seats in from the end, and ask, how does that person listen to a sermon? Putting it another way, the kind of thing we did the other night was a logical development of the sermon. And And when you do a logical development, you have an outline. Roman numerals, A's, B's, 1s, 2, indented. The prime concern is the content and how the content is arranged. Important. Idea must have structure. It must take form. But a second way of looking at the sermon from the point of view of the audience is not only to look at it logically, but to look at it psychologically. That is, to try to develop an approach to preaching in terms of the way that people listen. So tonight I'd like to look at preaching from the point of view of the person in the pew and try to develop a psychological outline. In order to do that, let me just step back for a moment and paint in just a little theory. And that is, when you get up to speak, what you're trying to do is to take voluntary attention and turn it into involuntary attention. When you start to speak, people give you their attention. What you need to do is to take it. Begin to speak, the rules of the game are that folks listen because they have to. Either that or they are an unruly mob, like some of you, or they are sound asleep like the rest of you. But if the game is played according to the rules, they listen because they have to listen. Your trick is to get them to listen because they want to listen. So you turn voluntary attention into involuntary attention. Now the question is, how do you go about doing that? So let me give you just a bit more theory. You want to get and hold attention. But if you work at the level of attention, you'll discover that's almost an exercise in futility. Because attention is a very fleeting thing. It comes and it goes. If you're driving a car down the highway, the chances are that the center of your attention will change 200 times in a minute. So as you're preaching, attention can easily wander off. It's important to get attention, but you cannot get attention by focusing on attention. We know that we give our attention to what we're interested in. And interest is longer lasting. So if I want to get attention, I have to work at what people are interested in. Two people take a trip across Canada. If one is a sociologist and the other is a geologist, they come back and show you their slides. The chances are the slides will be quite different. They may have visited the same provinces, but the sociologist will show you pictures of people in crowds, while the geologist will show you pictures of rocks. The point is, they gave their attention to what they were interested in. So when you are interested in something, that determines attention. Take it one step further, and not only do you have attention and interest, but we find ourselves interested in things we need. So need is even more basic. If you perceive that you need the information, then you're interested in it. And if you're interested in it, you give your attention to it. So if we can find a way of arranging material that takes that bit of theory and actually puts it into practice, then there's a good chance that when we speak, we will preach as listeners like it. So what I'd like you to do is to imagine that it is Sunday morning. It's about 11:27. Quite a few things have gone on. There has been the opening hymn, and then there's been prayer, and then there's been two other hymns. Then there's been the reading of the scripture, and then you came to halftime, and you had the offering and the announcements. And then the choir has sung. And now it's time for you. If you're going to survey that audience and ask them how they felt at 11:27, the chances are that they are a little bit bored, and they have a deep suspicion you're going to make matters worse. And if you were to ask that audience for the reaction to your getting up to preach, oh, hum. If you're going to overcome that whole hum, then what you must do is to begin your message with an interesting statement. Let me show it to you another way. Imagine that you are on one island and your listeners are on another island. And your island, you find that it's inhabited with the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But the island of your listener is inhabited with crabgrass. And the fact that their wife is going to have a baby, or their kids aren't doing well at school, or they may lose their job, or wondering whether they're going to catch the sports event on television in the afternoon. Two different worlds, two different realms of interest. So if you are going to get that other people on the other island to listen, what you have to do is to build a fire. That's what you do when you make that opening statement. It's hard to stress too strongly how important the first 25 words of a sermon are. They may not be completely clear, but they ought to be interesting. They ought to get people's attention. Those opening words give a flavor for what is going to follow. Therefore, early on in those opening words, you try to say something that will build the fire and get the people to listen. What you really want to try to do, if you can, is to start in the 20th century. You want to talk about where the people are, not where the text is. For example, if you started a message by saying, according to the Gallup poll, 60% of husbands will be unfaithful to their wives at least once during their marriage. I suspect that some of you here have made up part of that statistic. Whatever else you think about that, it gets attention. You begin by saying to an audience, let me tell you the story of a man that influenced me dramatically. I'll call him John Smith, because that happened to be his name. Or suppose you begin a message by saying, I wonder if there's ever been a time in your life when you have doubted, when you've seen the things you thought were certainties coming loose at the roots. An opening statement gets attention. Let me tell you what you don't do in the opening statement. You don't begin by saying, last week we were in Genesis 22. This week we are in Genesis 23. Next week we'll be in Genesis 24. Sometimes when you hear an introduction like that, that preacher is making assumptions about the audience that are absolutely ridiculous. I have a hobby when I travel, and that is on a Saturday, I like to read the religious page of the paper. I like to read the titles. It's interesting, as you read the titles, you learn something about the church. There are some church ads that don't have any titles. What they say is, this church is premillennial, pre-tribulational, dispensational, separatist. Everybody welcome. Kind of a mixed message. But what you do get is, a title of a message says, The History of Jacob. And you wonder, why in the world bother with a title that is as anemic as the history of Jacob? You imagine what would have happened, say, last weekend, when your snow came and assumed that the churches hadn't closed. Imagine somebody getting up on a snowy Sunday morning and saying to his wife, boy, it's a bad day today. I wonder if we're going to go to church. And his wife saying, oh, we can't miss today. They're going to talk about the history of Jacob. I mean, on a sunny day, that'll keep you home. The idea that people care about Jacob.
absolute monstrous nonsense. What happens with that title, what happens with a lot of titles, what happens with a lot of opening lines, is they start in the wrong place. They start 20 or 30 centuries ago. And the beginning of the message says, so why are you on today, folks? We're going to talk about Jacob. And if you're not interested in Jacob, it's not going to be much of a sermon. You set a tone. You go after the mind. And you do it in those opening words. Let's assume that you pulled it off. Let's assume that you have had an opening statement that has some interest. You and I both know that the attention isn't going to last very long. So the audience asks a second question. And that is, why bring this up? What you want to do in response is to create or surface a need. In other words, what you want to do is to tell them very early on why this sermon is going to be important to them. All of this is based on a principle in communications called Cohens Law. The reason it's called Cohens Law is the man by the name of Arthur Cohen invented it. They're very clever over in the realm of communication and labeling laws. But the law is important. It says that information that is given in response to a perceived need makes a deeper impact and lasts longer than information that's given and then applied. Let me say that again because it's very important. Information that's given in response to a perceived need makes a deeper impact and lasts longer than information that's given and then applied. That is simply saying that an audience instinctively asks, why bring this up? And what you want to do is to tell them. Imagine that we took a trip over to France. And imagine that the tour bus stops outside a French village, and the tour conductor says something like this. Ladies and gentlemen, this village has played an important part in the history of France. To go into the village, over to the left, you will find a clothing store. That clothier has been supplying uniforms for the French army and costumes for the French nobility for hundreds of years. Across the way, you will find a pub. It said that Napoleon and his men in that pub made plans for one of their large campaigns. Center of the city, you'll see a large statue. It's a statue to Joan of Arc. When Joan of Arc was beginning her crusade, she stopped at this town, and the people have erected a monument to her memory. Beyond the monument, you will find a food store. It has all kinds of delicacies, some of them native to this region. And beyond that, you will find a cemetery that has stones that go back almost 600 years. And beyond that, there is an exit to the city, and in a matter of 35 or 40 minutes, the bus will reach you. So you get off and say to your wife, did he say we could get a cup of tea? You know, you just wander through, you listen, you may remember some of it, you may remember none of it. Let's suppose, instead of being on a tour bus, let's suppose it's World War II. And instead of a tour guide, the person talking to you is a member of the French underground. You have parachuted behind the lines. You're a member of the Allied forces. And you crouch outside that town, and he says to you, listen, I can only say this once. Remember. You go into this town, over to the left. You will find a clothing store. Be very careful. We think those people are collaborators with the Germans. But across the way, you'll find a pub. Germans often go there to have their beer in the afternoon. You would be wise to avoid it. center of the city, however, there's a large monument, casts a dark shadow, and it's possible that if you needed a place to hide, you might find some help there. But beyond that, there is a food store. We believe those people are friends, and if you are in danger, they'll take you in. Beyond that, there's a cemetery. Germans don't go into that cemetery, and it's possible that you could hide there among the stones if you had to. Beyond the cemetery, in a matter of an hour or so, a friend will meet you and take you to freedom. Au revoir. I guarantee you that you'll remember what he said. The reason is that information that's given in response to a perceived need makes a deeper impact and lasts longer than information that is given and then applied. If you talk to people who have read the traditional homiletics and you say to them, where do you put the application? Almost always the answer is at the end. If you wait 35 minutes to tell people why they need this, they are gone home, even though they're sitting in their seat. They will not wait around to find out. Up front, you show them why they need what you have to say. A couple of months ago, when I was in New York, I had a meal with a vice president of one of the large publishing firms. It's his task to evaluate a great many manuscripts and decide what manuscripts he will have his company publish. So I said, well, how many manuscripts do you evaluate in a year's time? And he said, well, last year was a little over 600. I said, well, look, I read rapidly, but there is no one I know who can read 600 manuscripts in a year. And he said, well, I don't read them all. He said, what I do is I read the first paragraph. I figure that the first paragraph, that writer has given some thought to that. It tells me a great deal about the quality of what will follow. If the first paragraph has some interest to it, then I go ahead and I read the next few pages. If he hasn't, in the first few pages, gotten hold of the jugular vein and slammed me up against the wall, showing that he intends to hold me there to the end of the book, I just figured if he isn't going to do that in the opening pages, the rest of the book is bound to be boring, and I put the manuscript aside. Like that or not, whether it's fair to the author or not, that's the reality. An audience gives you just a couple of minutes to get started, to get their attention, to create a need. So when you begin, what you want to do is to go after attention, that first line, and go after need in the rest of the paragraph. Many times when I look at sermons or listen to them, what I discover is that the preacher knows that he has to get attention in the introduction. He doesn't know that. He really doesn't know much about communication. But what he will do in order to get the attention is to tell a story. But often what the story does is to give the sermon away. That is, the story, while it gets attention, answers questions. But the story you want up front is a story that raises questions. You don't answer the questions until the sermon is complete, because the minute the questions are answered, the sermon is over. So what you're doing is creating tension. You're raising and meeting questions. And as personal as you can make those questions, the stronger your message will be. The third question an audience asks, or the third response, is, what's your big idea? That is, if you have created a need, what they want to know is, how do you plan to solve it? What you need to do is, someplace in that sermon, know your point, know what the sermon's about, and state it. It's hard to underline too strongly the need for having in a sermon a single generative idea. If you ever get a sermon, you get it as ideas. You don't get a sermon as points, you don't get it as illustrations, you don't get it as fragments of exegesis, you don't get it as points about archaeology. When you stand up to preach, your task is to get an idea across to an audience. What you want to do is to search for that idea by answering those two questions we looked at the other evening. The subject, what is this person talking about, or what am I talking about? The complement, what am I saying about what I am talking about? You must doggedly pursue the answers to those two questions. If you can't answer the question, then the sermon will be vague and rambling. If you can't answer those questions, the reality is you don't know what you're talking about. Any given Sunday, this is one of those statistics I grab out of the air, but any given Sunday, I would guess that fully 80% of the people who preach in the United States and Canada could not answer those two questions if their life depended on it. And what is really important is that the lives of the people in front of them depend upon it. What are you talking about? Can't be a single word. You can't preach a sermon on patience. In 35 minutes you can't. You can't write a book on patience in 35 minutes. It has to be the complete, definite answer to the question, what am I talking about? And then what is the major affirmation I am making about that subject? Or the major affirmations I'm making about it? That ought to be as clear to you as a cloudless moon. Because you'll discover that what's a mist in the pulpit becomes a fog in the pew. If you don't know what you're talking about, the congregation doesn't have a chance in the world of finding out. Now, when you get that idea, you ought to state it in as contemporary and as concise a way as possible. That's not a rule that was given on Mount Sinai or even invented by homileticians in the back room of a speech convention. That's just the realization that people have a better chance of remembering something if it's stated in a pithy and interesting fashion. And ultimately, if you think about what you're doing as a preacher, you are trying to implant principles in the mind of the congregation. You get those principles from the Bible so that people see the authority for what you are saying. But the reality is that after they forget the exegesis, after they forget the points, after they forget the sermon, if you can drive home a principle in their lives, then they'll have something to live for and something to die for. So what you are trying to do is, as you bring them across, by raising the question, why bring this up, you are building a bridge between your interests and theirs. And then, doing that, what you want to do is to show them your treasure. You want to show them the idea you are trying to get across. My son, Tori, who is a novice preacher, was preaching on Philippians chapter 2. That great kenosis passage, and talks about our Lord Jesus, and it says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being the form of God, thought it not a thing to be grasped at, to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of men. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God has highly exalted, given him a name that is above every name. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is God, to the glory of God the Father. That is a great passage of Scripture. If you look at it in its context, Paul quotes that, perhaps really an ancient Christian hymn, to tell these Christians how they are to regard one another, how they are to live with one another. It's an intensely practical passage. At any rate, Torrey preached a message in which he said, as he began, there are really only two kinds of people in the world. There's the here I am people, and the there you are people. Here I am people can sometimes be extroverts. They're the people, when they walk into a room, are loud and boisterous. It's their way of saying, here I am, everybody notice me. Or they can be introverts. They can be the kind of folks who sort of fade into the wallpaper and sort of stand back, hoping nobody notices them, but wishing somebody will. Here I am. But, Torrey said, there is also the there you are people. There you are people, the folks who walk in the room and say, oh, there you are. I notice you. You matter to me. I wanted to say that people that make a difference in the world are the there you are people. And Jesus Christ is turning here I am people into there you are people. That's what that passage is about. I mention that to you because he preached that sermon while he was a student at seminary in a church in our town. To this day, and I guess, that was 4 years ago, you go to Emmanuel Baptist Church, people will say, you know, Bill is a real there you are person. They don't even know where they got that from. But that handling of that passage with that kind of pithy statement developed from the Philippian letter, because you remember Paul talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus, both of them were there you are people. That statement sticks, and it has had a way of characterizing the people in the congregation. You need to know your point. You need to know how to frame it, and do your best to drive that home in your sermon. And after you get the folks over to your island looking at your treasure, well, the next thing that people ask as you're developing your message is, for instance, what you want to do as you're developing your message is to be specific. It is the incessant demand of an audience to say, for example, for instance, you will discover that the good speaker is more likely than the poor one to keep answering that question, to keep giving you examples. The poor speaker is the one who is constantly saying, in other words. He started out, got the whole thing fouled up with the first bunch of words, and now he's going to use some other words to clarify what he didn't do well with the first bunch of words. If you want to amplify a message, develop a message, then one of the things you must do is to work with illustrations. Whenever you make a statement of any sort, there's only 3 things you basically can do to develop a statement. One is you can explain it. The second is you can prove it. The third thing you can do is to apply it. That is the only thing you can do to develop an idea. You either explain it, you prove it, you apply it. Now, since that's the way communication works, then you can develop any kind of lecture or sermon by answering, with what does that mean? Is that true? So what? What difference does it make? By using an illustration. For example, you can explain a truth by using an illustration. That's what we mean often when we talk about an analogy. Dorothy Sayers, the mystery writer, in one of her books, develops the concept of the moral law of God. That moral law, which is really an expression of God's justice as it affects the whole created world. You can read a lot of books about the moral law of God and sometimes come away confused and bewildered. But in developing it, Dorothy Sayers says, when you start to think about it, there are really only 2 kinds of laws. One is the law of the stop sign. The other is the law of the fire. The law of the stop sign says that there's a lot of traffic going down a certain street, and so the city council meets and decides they will put up a stop sign. And then they decide that if you run the stop sign, it's going to cost you $25. A number of people may feel it's worth $25 to run the sign, so they can up the ante. They can make it $50 or $75. Or they may erect a highway around the town, so traffic no longer goes down that street. So the city council, if it chooses to, can take the stop sign down. It's the law of the stop sign. But he said there's also the law of the fire. Law of the fire says that if you put your hand into fire, you get burned. So she says, imagine that all of the nations, all the legislatures of all the nations of the entire world were to gather in one great conclave. And they were to vote that from here on out, fire would no longer burn. And it was unanimous. She said the first person to leave the assembly and put his hand into a fire would discover something about the law of the fire. And that is that bound up in the nature of fire is the penalty for abusing it. Even God himself cannot change that without changing the nature of fire. So she says, the moral law is like the law of the fire. You don't break God's laws, you just break yourself on them. And no legislature can nullify the law of the fire, because inherent in fire is the penalty for abusing it. Whether or not you like that illustration, whether you think it captures the moral law, I never think of the moral law of God without thinking of that illustration. A while ago, we had a talk show in the city of Denver. The discussion was on AIDS and moral implications of it. One of the questions I was asked was, do you believe that AIDS is the judgment of God on homosexuals? That question is loaded. So I said, well, it depends what you mean by the judgment of God. I said, the question is, do you mean zap judgment or process judgment? If you mean zap judgment, I don't think that AIDS is God's judgment on a homosexual. That is, here's a homosexual, and that's it. Zap! You get AIDS. You mean process judgment? I think it is process judgment. And I told my story about the law of fire. I said, when the Bible prohibits promiscuity, when it prohibits homosexuality, if this is a moral universe and God is behind it, you don't break the laws without those laws breaking you. That's true in every realm. And the law of the fire is a law that isn't rescinded, whether it's for heterosexuals or homosexuals. Discovered the story carried the point. That to have stayed on some level of abstraction would have caused all kinds of negative reaction. Enough negative reaction as it was. But I think if you're going to make the point and explain it, the illustration is the way to do it. That's true, by the way, in proving a point. You can, by the use of an illustration, prove your point. For example, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, it's interesting when the Apostle Paul does that. I pause for a moment to point this out simply because I think the Bible is filled with illustrations, and because we're not used to looking for them, or we're looking for anecdotes, we miss what the biblical writer is doing. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is talking about the resurrection from the dead. His point is that the body rises from the grave. Greeks believed in immortality. They believed that the soul lived on, but they did not believe the body lived on. So Paul's point here is that we will be raised, our bodies will be raised, and his proof is that Christ was raised. But he comes to verse 15 of, verse 35 of 1 Corinthians 15. He says, but someone may ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? You understand the question. Somebody hears Paul out and says, wait a minute, Paul. Here's a man who is a sailor. He's out in the Mediterranean Sea. He dies. And they can't bring him to shore, so they bury him at sea. Then a fish nibbles on him, eats him, and then a fisherman on shore catches the fish, and then he eats the fish, and then the refuse of the fisherman gets on in the dirt. How are the dead raised? What kind of body will they come? And Paul's response is, that's a stupid question. You ought to know the answer. He says, how foolish. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you don't plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps a wheat or something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined. And in each kind of seed, he gives his own body. All flesh isn't the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, fish another. There are also heavenly bodies. There's earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly body is one kind, the splendor of the earthly body is another. The sun is one kind of splendor, the moon another, the stars another. Stars differ from stars. Splendor. Paul simply saying is, it's not that tough a question. Reminds me of the time I was a kid in New York, and one of the things they want to teach you in the ghetto is that things grow. So what they do is they give you a window box, and and you plant bean seeds. I remember planting the seeds, and planted them one day. I figured they ought to be up the next, and they weren't. And a day or so later, I dug into it, and I found that the seed had decayed. Squish. But the teacher blew this one, and I covered it all up, thinking, he'd never find out. But a little while later, a sprout came up, and a beanstalk. Now, that was connected to that seed that had decayed, but it was different from the seed. Related to it, but different. Paul could have talked in our day about the DNA molecules. But what he is simply saying is, the body that will be is in some way related to this body that is buried, but it will be different from it. As different as the stalk of wheat will be from the grain you put in the ground. But you see that happening, it ought not overwhelm you that God can do that. And from the body that is buried in the Mediterranean and all the parts, he can bring that new body that is related to the old and very different from it. That's not scientific explanation. But that is a way to win belief, by simply saying, in this realm in which you live, you see something like that. So when this person raises the question, is that true? Do I really believe it? Paul's way of answering is by the use of an illustration. Then, of course, you can apply the truth by illustration. What you're simply doing is saying, this is how this works in somebody's life. If you are a good communicator, illustrations become your magnificent obsession. In order to define, in order to explain, in order to apply, you answer the question that's asked again and again. For instance, be specific. Give me an example. You need to save it. You need to work at saving. You need to cultivate it. And you need to think that way. The final question that is asked is, so what? What do I do about this? And the answer to that is somehow or other suggest an action. Again, to go back to my illustration, after people have seen the treasure and gotten down to cases, they ultimately have to leave your island and go back to the island where they live for the rest of the week. On my desk in the seminary where I studied, I have a bit of poetry. It says, as Tommy Snooks and Betty Brooks were leaving church on Sunday, said Tommy Snooks to Betty Brooks, tomorrow will be Monday. That has got to be the ultimate low of social conversation. But for the preacher, it is the ultimate high. Tomorrow will be Monday. And if the truth I have preached today is of any value at all, the truth of Sunday morning's sermon must do something in Monday morning's world. When Paul wrote his letter to Timothy, he said all Scripture is inspired by God. It's profitable for four things. It's profitable for doctrine, for rebuke, for correction, and instruction in right living. And all four of those things accomplish one thing, that the man or woman of God will be completely furnished to every good work. So when I preach, I have an idea in my head of what good work this sermon will produce. If I don't know, they're not going to find out. What do you expect might happen if somebody in that congregation took the sermon seriously? What might happen in tomorrow's world? And if you can be specific, if you can give them some idea of how this will carry out, there's a better chance that they will do it. Every now and then, we have students at the seminary have this kind of pious glow about them. What they say is, what I do is I lay out God's truth, and I depend on the Spirit of God to apply it. That's a cop-out. You'll find that if you take that truth and apply it to one group in your church, for example, take a truth and apply it to teenagers. Show how it works in the life of a teenager. The businessman, the housewife, the older citizen will hear that, and there's a better chance that they will apply it in their own life experience than if you simply leave the whole thing up in the air and hope that somehow everybody in the congregation will apply it. Because there is a rule of vicarious identification. That is, when I watch a program on television, that program may have taken place in the 1800s, may have taken place in another part of the world. But as I watch, I identify with the characters, and as I identify with the characters, the lesson comes through. I can, by watching that specific drama, get the message, and I have a better chance of bringing it into my life. So, when you apply the message, for someone in that crowd, it ought to be specific enough so that they would have some idea of what they might do in Monday mornings. Anyway, that's the motivated sequence. That's speaking as listeners listen. If you take this outline and apply it to what we normally think of in a logical outline, the first 2 points are really what would make up the introduction. Good introduction gets attention and establishes need. The second two are what you are doing in the body of the message. That is, you are getting across an idea, and the major way you develop it is by the use of illustration. And the so what usually is something that appears in the conclusion. It certainly ought to be someplace in the sermon. But you will have a good conclusion if you will take this conclusion back to that need and show people how what you have said responds to the need and how they can put it into life. And if you will take that psychological outline and impose it on the logical outline, you'll be somebody whose preaching is oriented to both worlds. All right, we have a few minutes. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask about this or any of the other? Yes, I see your hand.
Do you think that the best illustrations are found in your everyday life experience and imagination, or are the books that are written on illustrations adequate? And my second question is, how does a person think illustratively?
Okay. First question is, let me give a bit of theory. If you think of the way, if you think of somebody, say you're listening, two areas that you'll in a listener's life. One is the area that is shown by the blue, the other is the area shown by the white. This inner area is the thing that the listener has experienced. This is the house he has lived in, the dog he has owned, the girl he has kissed, the schooling that he has had. It's the personal experiences. This outside is the thing, or the things he has read about, heard about. Some things, like a very vivid movie, will be very close to that inner experience. It's almost as though you have experienced it. So the listener has the inner experience and has the outer experience. You as a preacher also have those two areas. You have an inner experience and an outer experience. Things you've done and experienced, the things you've read about. The best illustrations come where P2 overlaps L2, right in here, where I am talking about the things I have experienced and the things the audience have experienced. This is what we usually mean by human interest illustrations. This is why illustrations about children, illustrations about dogs, have a kind of universal appeal. Illustrations from the comic strips often not only get across the truth, but they sort of have a warmth about them. What you're trying to do, by the way, when you preach, is not only to touch the intellect, but touch the feelings. And so those illustrations work on both levels. You feel them, and you understand them. Second best place for an illustration is where your outside experience, which you've read about, heard about, overlaps the listener's inner experience. Because you're always speaking to your listeners. So if I can, in some way, identify with that experience, that's what I want to do. When I talk to teenagers, one of the things I do, my kids put me up to this, I try to look at the New York Times listing, the 40 top songs. And sometimes I go, and all I do is read the list. And I will come to a group of teenagers and say, let's see, this is the top 40 last week. Just read the titles. Begin to laugh. But often the titles of those songs are a dead giveaway to where they're at. I don't really listen to that music. I got to go to the New York Times to find out what's out there. But they listen to it. That's where they live. Music is the jargon of the kids. By doing that, what I'm doing is taking something I've read about and trying to put it into their life. The third area is where your inner experience overlaps their outer experience. For example, I grew up in the ghetto of New York. When I talk about the ghetto of New York, I can talk about it very vividly. I lived there. I know what poverty is. I know what it is to live a couple of years of my life, literally, in fear of being killed. I can talk about that with great vividness, great emotion. You may never have lived there. You do not know how fortunate you are to live in a place like Nova Scotia. But you've heard about it, and so I can tell it vividly, and you may have heard about it, so the overlapping there is worthwhile. Fourth level is where my experience that I have read about overlaps the experience you've read about. That kind of an illustration would be an illustration that comes out of the Roman Empire. I've read about the Roman Empire, you've read about the Roman Empire. But it is really a poor illustration because it doesn't touch the inner core of our being. The worst illustration is where I take something that I have either experienced or read about, and you don't know anything about it at all. I submit that biblical illustrations in our day fall there. For somebody to say, now you remember how that worked out in the life of David. No, they don't remember how it worked out in the life of David. The purpose of an illustration is to take something that is unknown and illustrate it by the known. I know all the stuff that you're trying to teach people, all the Bible. If you're teaching Ephesians, you get enough problem teaching Ephesians. If you're going to use an Old Testament illustration, you better tell that illustration vividly so that you bring it into people's experience. So my long answer to your short question is that the best illustrations are here inside. And they're usually illustrations that you've experienced. There's a myth out there that you don't use personal illustrations. That's insane. You live your life with personal illustrations. What you usually mean by that is you don't use personal illustrations that make you look good. Nobody likes a braggart. You don't like a braggart 1-on-1 or 1-on-200. The person that says, I was dealing with this man the other day, and he raised this question, I raised this question, he raised this question, and boy, did I trump him. A little bit of that goes a long way. But most personal illustrations are just personal. I observed them, I saw them. It doesn't mean that I was a hero, it doesn't mean I was a chump, it just means I was there. And you will tell that in a more vivid way. So personal illustrations are not only acceptable, they are preferable. And so the closer I can get to the inner core of experience, the more I want to use that in order to illustrate. Your second question was, how do you cultivate the ability to illustrate? One of the ways you do it is by collecting. I make it a kind of project to try to save 20 illustrations a week. Don't always meet my goal, but I get there. Saving illustrations will do two things for you. One is, you'll get the illustrations. You'll find that, get a collection of them. Second thing it does is it makes you aware of illustrations. You discover as you save them, as you collect them, as you read, for example, things leap out at you. You realize that's how this man is developing this point. That's how this woman has gotten across the idea. That's a good way to do it. That's an excellent illustration. You become aware of the process simply by saving. One of the major ways you do it is to look for it. When I am working on a message and I have an abstraction, then my question is, how do I amplify that? And what I know I must do is to get down closer to life. And so what I do is write out on the paper the point I want to illustrate. Discover you don't know the point. It's awfully hard to illustrate it. And many times what you're doing is kind of illustrating a vagueness. You're not sure what you're illustrating. So what exactly do you want to illustrate? And then I let my mind wander. And because of working on this process, collecting illustrations, thinking about them, I find that my mind will come to some kind of concretion. And I work at it in order to get an illustration. You can cultivate that ability. In one of the courses that I teach, I have the students collect 75 illustrations on one idea. Choose the idea. You've got to have 75 illustrations. First 5 come relatively easy. Next 5 get to be close to sheer torture. The next 10, I invariably have people say, I just can't do it. After they hit the 20th one, they hit their stride. Suddenly the whole world becomes a picture book for them. It is amazing how you are able to illustrate after you begin to think that way. When you know what you want to get across, it seems like everywhere you turn, there's some way of illustrating. So it can be learned, but you have to dedicate yourself to do it.
A lot of pastors have people in their congregations that are at different levels educationally. Like some may have a grade 8 education, some may have 13 doctorates. How do you preach a sermon that is stimulating to both groups of people? How do you reach both? I had one pastor say to me that he always spoke at the lowest level so that everyone could understand the sermon. Now that to me doesn't sound very effective.
Well, I think preachers often have the problem of overestimating the knowledge that their people have. And the corresponding problem is underestimating their intelligence. The fact that somebody has 2 or 3 doctor's degrees does not necessarily mean that when he gets over into the realm of ethics or theology or exegesis or whatever you want to call it, that he is an expert over there. In fact, I think that there's a kind of arrogance that professionals assume about their disciplines. For example, when I go to a physician's office, every now and then, and he's so used to talking the medical jargon, he's going to tell me what's wrong with me by giving me the medical terms. And I say to him, look, I'm paying you money, not only to examine me, but to tell me what's wrong with me. And I don't understand. Don't give me those big words. And I mean it. I think that's a colossal insult for somebody in a profession to be using the jargon with the layman. That's a put down. And I think when you do that, you are insulting the person you're talking to. In the same way, it's an insult for me to assume that he knows my jargon, or even that he is Delaware Senator. So sometimes the idea that this person's got a PhD, this person's got an 8th grade education, and therefore they never meet, I find that they do meet. I find that you can get across. A person can read C.S. Lewis if they can read. It's amazing how he cuts across a wide range of people. I think, secondly, illustrations help you to cover that gap. The illustration may have greater significance to one person than to another. But the illustration is a way of getting the truth without fooling around with large, difficult abstractions. Usually, educated people handle abstractions better. You go to a university and you learn to abstract. You walk in and you talk about murder, rape, robbery, adultery, you leave and you're talking about hematology. I mean, that's an abstraction. You learn to get broad categories to cover the specifics. But if you get down and dwell with the specifics, no matter where the person is, you paint a picture in their mind. And Walter Lippmann was right when he said that people think of pictures in their mind. That's true whether you're a PhD or whether you've got an 8th grade. By the way, just in passing, education helps you to abstract, therefore it makes you a scholar. Education gets in the way of being a communicator. Because as an educated person, you learn higher levels of abstraction. But you find it in the social sciences, the people in sociology can't talk to the people in psychology. They've got different jargon. They can't communicate with one another. I mean, that's just a reality. You find that there's all kinds of efforts trying to get these folks to make sense to one another. But if you're communicating, what you need to do is to take the abstraction, the high level of abstraction, and come down close to life. That's what a good communicator does. That's why, by the way, when I was taking my master's work, I had to make up a course in geology. We had a professor who had a double PhD in his field. I don't know how he was doing. I'd sit there, and here I was. I was a graduate of college, seminary, the whole bit. I didn't know who he was talking about. And I so needed anybody else. The guy who interpreted it to me was the graduate assistant. You know why? Because he was closer to me, closer to the pit from which I had done. His PhD, if I'd asked him, like, what's 1 and 1? Turned it into a mathematical equation. He could not think about where I was. Good communicators always do, and therefore they are able often to span the gulf. The great preachers. There's something there that the idea is great enough for everybody, and the way they explain it is concrete enough so that all kinds of people identify it. That's the value of illustration.
Yes, I have a question. I'm wondering whether it's intentional or whether it's a coincidence. I noticed in the evening lectures you were fairly heavy, beginning off with humor and warming up the group. But in the chapel service, you didn't do that. And the reason I'm asking this is because it seems to be quite a popular trend to catch the people's attention, as you're suggesting we need to do, but to do it with a funny story or a joke, whether it's related or not. And I'm wondering whether...
Very good question. You're really asking the whole question about humor, how you use it. It's very dangerous. The humor is very effective and very dangerous. With a group like this, when I come in, it's been a long day, and all of those things. I tend to start with some humor, simply to say, look, I'm not as fierce as I look, I'm not as bad as I look, or if I'm as bad as I look, at least I'm funny. So, part of what you do with humor as you begin is it's a way of establishing rapport with the group. On the other hand, if I were preaching regularly to a congregation, I wouldn't do it. If I did it, I would be sure that what I did at the beginning that was humorous led into the message. Because the problem is often, you start off with humor, people enjoy the jokes, and then you get into the other stuff. Oh, here we go. Good stuff is over, now we're into the Bible. If you don't have humor anyplace else except up front, folks come for the jokes and then tune you out. Because what you get is their attention, and humor does that. But what you really want to do is to lead into that message. In that sense, what I have done during these days really is not good technique. My purpose was simply, you don't know me, really. And, the Simpson lecture sounds erudite and all the rest. And I sense that you come, so the sense of relaxing an audience is an important thing, but it's a very dangerous thing to do, because if you get into that introduction, and that introduction doesn't sustain that attention, then you've taken people up to a peak, and then the minute you begin, they're down and they feel the good part is over. So if it's used to illustrate the point, then humor is effective. But the danger of it is it'll take people off chasing rabbits when you want to chase lions.
I wonder if you could just clarify something. You said earlier on that don't wait 35 minutes to give them the application up front. You also said don't answer the questions up front or it's all over. Could you?
Yeah, but it's a good question. The application I meant is early on, they need to know. If they spend 25 minutes listening to you, there's a good chance the question will be answered. There's a good chance the tension will be solved. You don't wait till the end to do that. So there's a sense in which at the very beginning, as you get into something, you are anticipating what you're going to bring at the end as a life orientation. So that a good introduction is secular. It starts in the 20th century. It's personal. It sort of deals with where you are. It becomes biblical in that you're saying, we're turning to the Bible and to this passage, and you're telling them why you're turning to the Bible and why you're turning to this passage. And then it orients them to the body of the material. So early on, by raising the need, you are putting this into their lives. And the rest of the sermon is going to follow up on that. That's what I had in mind when I talked about application.
I have one more question.
Yeah. Would you comment, please, Dr. Robinson, on the importance of what comes before the sermon and after the sermon? I don't think that has been handled at all, but worship in general.
Well, in a service, the sermon should be part of the worship experience. It seems to me a well-planned sermon, a well-planned service involves the selection of the hymn, the praise that the people give. What you sing after the message is a way of the people, one way that people may respond to the message that you've given. What you really want to avoid, it seems to me, is having two parts. First part of the service we sing and choir sings and all that, and the next part I preach. It's the kind of thing you say, well, the preliminaries are over, now I'm here. In many, many services, preacher's the anticlimax. The music is what carries the audience. What you really want to do is to integrate the two. The setting in which you preach, the environment in which you preach, what goes before and after has a great deal to do with the way the people hear the message. So it's an excellent observation in your question. You don't preach in isolation.
Dr. Robinson, I want to say thank you very much for what you have shared with us.